Hello, Professor Spooner. How are you?
Good, good evening, Frank. I'm well, thank you, and enjoying the holidays, although it seems to be busier than ever. What I've been thinking about, because of the news that we've been watching and listening to over the last few weeks since we talked last, is the way violence and conflict in the world has been changing under globalization. And it's, of course, a long story, so that it becomes rather difficult to know where to start. But I grew up obviously in time to experience the what we know as the Second World War, and the 20th century is generally thought of as being the century with the century of wars.
Hmm.
And so far in the 21st century, we haven't had any real wars, but the quarrels and the conflicts at a lower level are proliferating and becoming more and more of a problem. And so, although there has been some discussion on and off over the years since we started talking about globalization some 25 years ago, about the relationship between globalization and conflict. Is conflict going to increase under globalization, or is globalization going to take care of conflict? There's not been that much discussion of it, and I can't think of any interesting ideas that have come out of any discussion of it.
Hmm.
Um, but I think it fits very well into the sort of things we've been discussing before. The biggest wars we know of come from the time when we had the biggest empires that we know of in history. And since we got rid of those empires, or they uh, disintegrated, the conflict has been very different. And there were a number of, I mean, if you can count the end of empires in the 1960s, I suppose, was when the largest number of colonial states became independent.
Right.
And then the wars we had in the second half of the last century were very different from what we'd had before then. And the conflict and violence that we have in the world since 2000 seems to be somewhat different pattern again. It's as though in the second half of the 20th century we were still um, uh, declaring war, and according to roughly the same paradigm that we were on before, whereas now we've grown out of that, and uh, we're not in control of anything anymore. Nobody declare. I mean, even though, of course, uh, the North Korea has declared war, or said that what the United Nations has done is declared war on them, and our current president has said things which could be interpreted as declaring war on North Korea.
Hmm.
I don't. I'm well. Basically, I suppose because I'm an optimist, I don't think that the war is going to break out between America and North Korea. So I'm not thinking of that. I'm thinking of what's going on in the Middle East in particular, and similar things that are happening in Africa and some other parts of the world. Even when there is severe disagreement on some borders, as in Kashmir, for example, it doesn't seem to be turning into war in the same way that it used to. And the question is, well, is this part of a process? And what's it likely to develop into by the end of this century? Or is it not a process, but just something that happens to be happening at the moment? And I think it's part of a process and has something to do with the way organization of everything is changing.
Hmm.
Um, and because I mean, we got rid of empires, and we still got nation states, and the nation states, in fact, grew up under empires and now have become the main uh, form of organization throughout the world in the second half of the 20th century, since the development of the United Nations in 1945. And they're not working very well, but it's the idiom within which, according to which everybody thinks about things. And the nation states are also, the organization within the nation states is also changing, because until a decade or so ago, the ones that were democratic worked democratically quite well, according to the plan that they had, which of ideally 2 or 3 party democracy. But now that's not working so well anymore.
Let me ask you a question. You noted that there's often an absence of a formal declaration of war, and I'm just wondering, you have all of these sort of low intensity conflicts floating around where governments can say that they're just protecting their own interests without necessarily having committed the whole national economic model to a total kind of war effort. Is some of that due perhaps to fear of global public opinion rising up as a result of increased globalization? I don't even think the Saudis are immune from that with what they're doing in Yemen, where that's definitely a hot war, but there's nothing formal going on, so to speak.
Well, certainly the fact that news travels so fast, and anything that attracts attention is known everywhere very quickly, that probably does have something to do with it. And I think that actually the war in Yemen is probably the worst example of war in process at the moment.
Yes.
But what you say is also interesting, that it's not clear what the formality of it is, and it obviously has a history, and it's part of a number of other processes in the Middle East, so that it's difficult to analyze exactly what's going on between Saudi Arabia and Yemen without taking into account also what's going on, what America is doing, what the history behind the situation in Yemen, the relationship between the interpretation of Islam that was part of was identified the government until not very long ago, and its relationship to Iran, and the whole patchwork of relationships between nation states that were formed in the colonial period, and don't really work on the ground now that the colonial period is over. So certainly that's also certainly part of the way the world in general has been changing.
I would have to say, though, to harken back to your initial hypothesis as to the effects of globalization on war and conflict, I would have to say that this increased rate of globalization overall, for the reason that you mentioned, the increased communication level, almost acts as a retardant on really overt moves by any regime to become excessively belligerent. I mean, they can't do it anymore without universal condemnation, and with the exception of a very small group of people like the North Koreans, people don't really want to risk that, it seems.
Yeah. But there are the North Koreans, and whether there's anything else, any other part of the world that might act in the same way, I'm not sure. Maybe not at the moment. And it's not clear to me what makes, why we have a North Korea in that form. I mean, I know historically how it was formed, but why it's behaving that way at the moment, I don't know.
I think a lot of it is
Anyway,
fear-based, perhaps, but anyway is right. Yeah.
It all seems to me to be related to this situation in which and I haven't worked out the best way to put this into words yet, but in every country within the country and the way the country works, there is much more participation
Yes.
in making everywhere than there ever used to be before. Instead of decisions being made at the top by whoever happened to be at the top, whether by whatever process, and then being accepted or put up with by everybody else, that's not what's happening anymore.
No.
And for that reason, that means that minor conflict between people who disagree with each other is much more likely to break out, I would suggest. So that on the one hand, what you suggested is very, very interesting, that there major conflict is much less likely because of globalization and the way everybody is participating globally in forming opinions about what would happen if a major war broke out. At the same time, on a lower level, we have less control.
Yes. 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 I would concur with that. Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. You've been doing a lot of thinking about this, I see.
Well, it's all the good food over Christmas. So.
Yes. Well, I think we're about at the end of our time. But thank you very much, Professor Spooner, and we'll look to do this again in the very near future.
In 2018.
And I'll see you next year. Yes. All right. Bye.